Hello, you fine internet folks. We are here in San Francisco, foggy San Francisco, for AMD's Advancing AI event, where many new products are being announced, but the one that interests me the most, and probably you guys, is AMD's brand new Zen 5 EPYC, codenamed Turin. Now, let's get the shocking news out of the way first. 5 gigahertz. Give you a moment, just let that sink in. 5 gigahertz on, true, they are high frequency SKUs, but what can be as close to mainstream SKUs as you can get on 64 cores, mind you. Now, all core boost is going to be slightly lower, depending on what you're doing, could be much lower, but 5 gigahertz, and we'll get a bit more into that because thanks to Jordan from Storage Review, we've had hands-on with the 9575F SKU. But let's sort of talk about the general specs of Turin. The Turin family has SKUs that use either Zen 5 Classic, which is what you can find in the desktop cores, or Zen 5 C cores, which are a version of Zen 5 C that have been optimized for density. Now, previously on Genoa and Bergamo, they were on the same node. They're both using TSMC's N5 process node. However, for Turin, they split that. The Zen 5 Classic CCD is on N4P, and the Zen 5C CCD is on N3. That's a new change for AMD. And not to mention another big change for Turin C is that it's one big CCX. With Bergamo, what you had was 2 CCXs of 8 cores for a total number of cores on the CCD of 16. With Turin, you now have 16 cores on a CCD, all attached to the same pile of L3. In Bergamo, you had 2 16 meg L3 caches. And in Turin, it's just one big 32 meg L3. Now, the density trade-off for Zen 5 does come at a bit of a cost, and that is the Fmax is only 3.7 gigahertz, which is still pretty impressive for a server CPU, mind you. For comparison, Intel's brand new Granite Rapids CPU is 3.9 gigahertz. Top boost, of course. Now, the difference, there's a difference between server Zen 5C and mobile Zen 5C, which is the server version of Zen 5C has the full fat 512-bit FPU, just like the standard Zen 5 core. Which, again, that's pretty nice to have that much FPU performance in a density core. Now, should you not need that for power reasons, in the BIOS, you can set the FPUs to be only 256-bit, just like Zen 4. It will behave very similarly to Zen 4. Now, moving from the CCD to the I/O die, Turin's new I/O die now supports 16 CCDs for the top 128 SKU. Core SKU, excuse me. This means that you now have 16 GMI links on the I/O die. What this allows is up to 8 CCDs to be connected with 2 GMI links. AMD calls this GMI 3 wide. Now, both the standard Zen 5 CCD and the Zen 5 C CCD support GMI 3 wide, which means that you can have up to 128 cores in the Zen 5 C version or 64 cores in the Zen 5 version connected to the I/O die with double the bandwidth to said I/O die. And that gives 2 advantages. One I just explained. And the second one is it allows for SKUs with fewer CCDs to access the full memory bandwidth that the memory system can provide. And speaking of that memory system, Turin supports up to 12 channels of DDR5 running at 6,000 megatransfers per second. However, 6,000 megatransfers per second is only supported in a 1 DIMM per channel, 1 DPC configuration. Should you have 2 DIMMs per channel, that does drop down to 4,400 megahertz. And should you have a configuration where you have a 2 DPC board, but only one of those channels, one of those DIMMs is filled per channel, then that speed goes to 5,200. Moving on to the PCIe support, it's exactly the same as Genoa, 128 lanes of PCIe Gen 5, with the addition of CXL 2.0 with device support 1, 2, and 3, with the same exact caveats as Granite Rapids, where Type 3 and Type 1 devices are, Type 3 devices are very well supported and Type 1 devices are getting better support, but Type 2 devices is still a proof of concept. There aren't really devices supporting that. Now, I would like to look at one SKU in particular, the 9575F, but it would be amiss of me to not mention a few other SKUs, and that is the 9965, which is the full-fat Turin C CPU that is 192 cores, 500 watts, and up to 3.7 gigahertz boost clock. And the other SKU that I would like to mention is the 9755, and that is the full-fat 128 core Turin SKU, 500 watts, up to 4.1 gigahertz. Now, there is a bit of a funny SKU, the 9175F, and that is 16 cores with 512 megabytes of cache. That's 1 core per CCD, which I personally find is a quite funny arrangement. That's likely for computational fluid dynamic workloads, which are very single-threaded most of the time, and like tons and tons of cache. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a V-cache version of this SKU, which would honestly be hilarious. And I believe that this is a 400-watt SKU out of the box. Now, the one that I would really like to dive into because, and again, I would like to give a massive thank you to Jordan from Storage Review, we have been able to test the 9575F. Now, to me, this is sort of the standout SKU. This is for OEM. I know that in the field, replacements of CPUs is not very common, but for OEMs and ODMs, to me, this feels like a sort of drop-in replacement for a lot of Genoa SKUs. Because while it is only 64 cores, it can boost that 5 gigahertz. When we were testing if you're loading 1 CCD, you were still hitting that full 5 gigahertz. No, the base clock is 3.3 gigahertz, and we did see that in Y-Cruncher. But Y-Cruncher being Y-Cruncher, it's a very APYC 512 heavy benchmark, and you sort of expect a significant pullback in clock speeds, and it was because it was running into that 400 watt limit. The 9575F is a 400 watt SKU. However, in Cinebench, we were able to see about a 4.25, 4.3 core gigahertz on all cores, and with SMT enabled, which is pretty darn impressive. Now, beyond that, we have been able to run some other benchmarks, our own internal suite of benchmarks. And I would like to start with the bandwidth for 1T, which this is what basically 1 core can pull. And the single-threaded read bandwidth is 52 gigabytes per second to memory. The write bandwidth is about 48 gigabytes to memory. And the add bandwidth, which is a read, modify, write test, is about 95 gigabytes per second. Now, moving up to the CCD level, and the bandwidth for reading from memory is 107 gigabytes per second. Writes is about 90 gigabytes per second. And read, modify, write, or as I'm going to truncate it to adds, is 141 gigabytes per second. Now, what this says is, yes, this SKU does in fact have GMI3 wide. And that what's interesting is that the write bandwidth on consumer CPUs, the read bandwidth to a CCD from the I/O die is 32 bytes per cycle, but the write bandwidth is only 16. What this tells me is that AMD has potentially increased from that 16 bytes per cycle per link to 32 bytes per cycle per link, for a total of 64 bytes for both reads and writes. Now, moving to the up again to the socket bandwidth, that memory subsystem of 12 channels of DDR5 6000 can produce up to, in theory, 576 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. And in our testing, we have gotten an incredibly impressive 569.5 gigabytes per second of read bandwidth. That's very close to theoretical, very nice results. Write bandwidth, a bit lower, which sort of expected. It's 435 gigabytes per second, and the add bandwidth is 453 gigabytes per second. Now, the cross-socket performance in our system only has 3 GMI links. Now, in both general and Turin, you can have either 3 or 4 GMI links connected to each CPU. The trade-off here is if you have 4 GMI links, you only have 128 lanes for both CPUs, whereas with 3 GMI links, you have 160 for both CPUs. However, the cross-socket bandwidth performance with 3 GMI links is 123 gigabytes per second read, 120 gigabytes per second writes, and 227.5 gigabytes per second adds. Now, moving to latency, memory latency without huge pages is 131 nanoseconds, and with huge pages, it's 116. Quite reasonable. And the remote latency is approximately 213 nanoseconds to cross to the other socket's memory system. And we have a fairly new test for you guys, and that is loaded latency. What this essentially is doing is, at the CCD level, it's loading as much memory bandwidth as it can. So let's say of the 8 cores on the CCD, you load 7 of them up with a memory bandwidth test, and you leave that 8th one unloaded. And you see what the latency is to memory with that unloaded core. If you scale that up to the socket, you can see what the bandwidth is if you have one CCD unloaded with all the rest loading at the memory system. Now, the local loaded memory latency is approximately 140 to 150 nanoseconds. And that is with huge pages. And the remote latency, loaded latency, is 220 to 225 nanoseconds. This is pretty good. You aren't getting much of a regression in latency, even when your memory system is loaded as much as it can be. Now, sort of rounding off our benchmarks, the local CCD to CCD latency is about 150 nanoseconds. So that's a CCD on a socket to another CCD on the same socket. And the remote CCD latency, so that's a CCD on socket 1 to a CCD on socket 2 for 250 nanoseconds. And that brings us to the end of our benchmarks. And frankly, I think a lot of these results are quite good. And especially the clock speeds that this thing has been able to hit. And in the end, I think that this will be a very, very competitive product that can match with the best that the market currently provides. Not just in the highest end of the 192 core and 128 core SKUs, but also in that 64 core SKU range where you want sort of lower power while still having quite a bit of that performance. So there are other announcements. However, this was the biggest one that I really wanted to cover. And I think that really brings us to the end of this. So I thank you for watching. Again, massive thank you to Jordan, whose room I'm currently in filming, because I arrived too early for the room to be available. And so go check out his stuff on Sword Review. I believe he's going to have a Turin review up. And with that, I have to show the liking and subscribing of the video and the channel. And have a good one, y'all. See ya.
Before you fully sign off, do you want to comment on the fact that from the hotel room we just beat the world record by like double?
So apparently I spoke too soon. This video hasn't quite ended because we have some brand new news.
So current is me on the 100 billion BBP at 10.2. We just did 4.5.
So in BrightCruncher's BBP benchmark at 100 billion, the current world record is Jordan from Storage Review, who has 10.557 seconds on Bergamo, correct?
That's on two-phase liquid cooling.
On two-phase liquid cooling. And this is air-cooled,
No,
correct?
That's on our Kool-Aid loop.
Okay, so on a regular liquid cooling loop, they just beat that by over double on, this is the 128 core dual socket?
That's the 192s.
Okay, so on the Turin C 192, this is 4.557 seconds.
With SMT on.
With SMT on. Remove SMT and I bet you could get this even lower. Yeah. Knowing how BrightCruncher works.
I'll be doing benching these competitively. I've got some custom OSs built this weekend, so look for a stream.
Yeah. Awesome.
Dope.
Yeah. You probably is there anything incriminating on here?
No, not by the time this little video goes out.
Yeah, if you guys can see that, hopefully you can see that. Awesome. Yeah, so we just broke the world record in this room. So, woo! Yeah, but I think, is that, okay, yeah. Okay. Well, second sign off for the video. Again, like, subscribe, and that's all, folks. Have a good one.